So welcome everyone to the new series of talks on directly experiencing no self. So I don't know how many.
I'm not sure I understand.
I'm not sure how many weeks that we'll move with this, but we'll kind of play it by ear. It'll be at least 5 or 6, I imagine. I keep thinking of new topics that fit in with this theme. So today I want to do a few things to kind of introduce the topic. So I want to first of all explore the difference, and it's a key difference between transcending the ego or transcending the self and the self or ego falling away. And it's a really important distinction between those two things, and it's very helpful to kind of have that understanding as we move through this. I also want to define the terms that we'll be using. So I want to define the term ego, define the word self, just so, I mean, these words get kind of thrown around, sometimes even interchangeably. And so I want to put some definitions. Doesn't mean that they're the only definitions for those terms, but at least we'll be talking about the same thing as we go forward. I want to talk really briefly about the importance of don't know mind or beginner's mind within this topic. It's crucial to bring that stance or point of view, I guess you could call it, to the practices that we'll be doing. And I want to outline 4 steps that I've kind of come up with that may comprise the journey that we'll undertake together. There's obviously other steps that could be in there, just 4 that kind of I found helpful for my own practice and found helpful in working with others. So I want to explore this. So the title is Directly Experiencing No Self. So the title is very important. So I want to do this in a way that's not philosophical or theological in any way. I want to explore it in an experiential way, based on observing our direct experience. And as we, you often hear in guided meditations to let go of the thoughts about your experience, let go of interpretations and commentary, just being with the direct experience itself, including thoughts about, commentary and so on. We're just letting that be as well. So there's no resistance to anything. So we'll be basically looking at observing our direct experience. So I don't want to get into a big philosophy about this, and this is really important. A lot of the books and talks online are presented in a very philosophical way. We can kind of get bogged down in the ideas and the debates about the nature of self and the nature of consciousness and free will and so karma and rebirth and all this, and we can get into very speculative mind states. It's not that we won't kind of explore those topics, but we'll be doing so in a experiential way. So not in abstract terms. So it's presenting it or hearing about it in an abstract way is generally not very helpful. It simply can provide the ego something else to grasp onto, right? A new collection of ideas that the ego can form a belief system and a philosophy around, and something that it can that the ego can latch onto, grasp onto, which simply sort of reinforces the egoic mind. And that's really the opposite of what this practice is all about. So what I will teach will be based on my own experience as far as it will take us, and what I've witnessed with others going through this. So it'll be based on the direct experience of either myself to a large degree, or what I've seen with others, including my teachers. And I kind of feel compelled to teach this at this time. I'm constantly discovering new ways to teach this. What I'll be teaching is completely different than what I've taught in the past. So I've taught 2 retreats, 7-day silent retreats on no self. And so I went back, of course, and looked at my notes, and I've even got the recordings. And I've realized I'm teaching something completely. I mean, it's the same in some ways, but it's just I guess matured in many ways beyond words, perhaps that I had read or been told, to more of an experiential way. I've also attended a few, I think 2 that I can remember, not self retreats as well. I think I've done this series once or twice in the Sang has been going for, I think, 11 years, somebody told me. It seems like it might not be that long, but time seems to go faster and faster. So maybe it has been that long. And some people, I sometimes I'm happy that, so many people showed up for this, because sometimes people see this topic and they think, oh, this isn't really for me. Is it going to be relevant for me? I remember when in the past, I've gotten emails saying, I've only been really practicing for a few years, and, I don't know if this will really be relevant for me. And I think no matter what your experience with the practice, some portion of it will be relevant and useful. Some portion of it will be. And many of you have had tastes of what I'll be talking about. So it's simply a matter of dwelling and cultivating what you have tasted. And also, it can be useful to have some knowledge of what might be coming at a later date, so you know how to kind of align yourself with the practice, to allow the self to drop away. You might also find out things and think, oh, okay, that's happened in my practice, or in the future it might happen. You go, okay, so this is part of the process, nothing to be alarmed about, or worried about. So that's sort of why I'm delving into this, and sort of how it came about. I really want to get into the core of the no self teachings. I don't want to run around the periphery of them. I want to get right into the core of them. So some of the philosophical questions we won't explore, at least philosophically. Instead, I want to get right at the core. We're going to explore directly experiencing no self. So how to practices that help us taste it, to see it, and experience perhaps the falling away of self. So I'm going to communicate this, obviously, using words, language, English language. And we can only partially do this with language, but we do the best we can. I mean, language literally fails in exploring this topic. And you'll see why as even the word experiencing, because no self brings you beyond experience. So even the word experiencing no self is a failure of language. The title itself is directly exposes the failure of language. So be aware if you're hearing words, that kind of contradict or don't make sense. It's just in many ways the failure of language. And notice too, if you hear words and then what the mind does is it jumps to an imagined future. Like, oh, I want to be this way. I want to be that way. If I could see no self, I'd be more compassionate. So on. These kind of thoughts that the mind goes into future mode, into an imagined future. So if you're measuring yourself against what I'm talking about or what I'm portraying, this is often not useful. Okay, so to be aware if that's arising in your experience. So language locks us into dualistic thinking by its very nature. Have you noticed that? So I can say, I am 6 feet tall, or my eyes are blue. So what I'm communicating is I am the body, right? I am 6 feet tall. So the language is communicating that I am body, or my eyes are blue communicates that I own the body. So you can see how this language itself reinforces a self view. And this is similar with thoughts and emotions. That's how we use language. And I'm not saying we don't use language. I mean, we need to communicate in some way to, obviously to get through the day and to navigate the world. But just to be aware that language doesn't capture what I'll be talking about, but we'll use language as best we can. I guess that's all I really want to say. So the first thing is the difference between momentary transcendence and the falling away or dissolution. Very, very important and often misunderstood. It's often misunderstood is that the experience of transcending ego or self is the same as the falling away of ego or self. Okay, so the transcending of ego is not the same as the falling away of ego. So, or the transcending of self is not the same as the falling away of self. No self is the falling away of self. It's not a momentary or transient, transcendent experience. It's a permanent cessation. The self dissolves, it falls away. No self is all that's left. So it's very, very, very important to see the difference between that momentary transcending and the permanent cessation of both ego and self. So just transcending ego does not mean that it disappears, right? Imagine in your practice you've transcended ego in different ways. You've tasted that. That's kind of where we start on this exploration of no self is transcending the ego. So I've had the experience of completely transcending ego identity, only to have the egoic mind re-arise to some extent, right? It reconfigures itself. It never does it in the same way or a complete way, but it can reconfigure itself, particularly if a fear arises. The ego, it's the worst terror of the ego is to fall away. It's to the ego. This is terror, right? So the dark night of the soul that is spoken about often is exactly referring to this aspect of ego falling away. So it tends to reconfigure itself in different ways. So it's just important to distinguish. So when I use the word transcendent, you know that it's this momentary transcendence and not a falling away, disillusion, or disappearance. Because, you know, the falling away of ego means that all clinging ceases. All grasping and holding on ceases. That's it. There's no, the ego has fallen away in that case. So when the ego falls away, all kind of self-concern, self-referential thinking thoughts disappear. The self can no longer identify with an egoic mind that's ceased. Right? There's no ego there for the self to identify with, to attach to. All the kind of psychological boundaries just drop away. And then this does not mean that no self has arisen. So the ego can fall away. The self is no longer identified with the ego, but the self can identify with something else. This is interesting. What the self can identify with being with the spiritual state, the divine. Self can identify with some other spiritual experience, compassion. I know that may sound contradictory because we do all these practices that align our our minds with compassion and loving kindness and so on. But the ego can fall away. The self can actually identify with this, can identify with being a Buddhist. So the self's a kind of slippery character, right? It tends to look for things then to attach to or identify. So I've used the word ego and self. So now I'm going to define it, but I wanted to first start out by the difference between transcendence, and I'll use that word a lot, and falling away. So ego is a process. It's an act. It's a verb. It's not an entity. And it's the act of self-obsession or concern. And it's all based on grasping and pushing away. Right? It's this friction or struggle with what is. The act of being obsessed with one's own inner concerns. So the ego is kind of the me, right? The me, in the realm of the thoughts and feelings, psychological processes, in the realm of craving and aversion. So an immature ego, if we can use that word, is very entirely concerned with how everything affects me. And you could kind of perhaps see this, at least I could when I was a teenager, and I'd get up in the morning and how my hair looked, and did I have the clothes that would gain approval from this group or that group? Did I have just everything was it was very much all about me, as they say. Everything was filtered through a kind of self-concerned. So with this egoic mind, we're kind of trapped in a view where concern about me is predominant. Right? And everybody starts here. Everybody has seen this in their likely in their younger years, and then you kind of see the ego mature a bit, right? It starts to reach out of its self-obsession, perhaps, into caring about things that are beyond just me. Could be loved ones, family, neighbor, culture, humanity, the planet. So as the ego matures, you can see that it becomes less and less fixated on me, or the inner psychology. Well, I hope that makes it kind of clear what this, because how many times have I used that word? And maybe you've been wondering what it actually means, what it's referring to. It's this this inner concern. And the ego will do whatever it can to sustain itself. And you've probably perhaps seen this in your practice. And since it can't know what is beyond itself, it sees the cessation of ego as a kind of death. And it can't know what is beyond its comprehension. So it feels this, it can feel almost a terror or an actual terror. It feels the death of itself. So this practice is not good news for the ego. In fact, it sometimes amazes me that the ego kind of comes along for the ride at all in this practice. And in fact, you perhaps see a lot of resistance from the egoic mind, and even sitting to meditate sometimes. We'll throw out all kinds of thoughts that cause you to get up off the chair or the cushion. And this is really the resistance of the ego. And so soon as if we believe all those thoughts, then of course we're identified with what the ego is narrating, then we will get up off the chair or the cushion. The self is also a verb. It's also an act, and it's the identification with some aspect of our experience. So in this case, the identification with ego. So it's the definition that I like is it's the unseen subject or witness of all experiences and perceptions. The unseen subject or witness of all experiences and perceptions. So you can never see the self because it's always the witness. So the self is the I. Remember, the ego is the me. You can kind of see the self as the I. I am such and such. So I am watching me. I am watching me. The self is witnessing the arising of egoic thoughts of the ego. So when there's deep identification, the I and the me are really fused. Right? So a lot of times people will use the terms interchangeably, and for me, that isn't so precise, but they can be one and the same in the sense that if there's a deep identification by the self with the ego, then they're fused. So in that sense, they are one. But the ego is really these self-referential perspectives, thoughts that are arising, and the self is simply identifying with that as being who it is. So the ego projects. So the self say, I am my thoughts. I am my opinions and judgments. There's the identification, right? The ego projects that onto the world and sees that things are as I say they are. What should happen is what is happening. So the self is the witness to the thoughts, feelings, ego. And when the self is identified with the ego, it can't even separate itself as the witness. So, and I'll talk a bit about this is really the first step that I'll explore is how we do separate the two. You see a lot of practices where the encouragement is to witness thoughts, emotions, body sensations, right? You hear this. And this is really kind of the first step in just seeing that there is a separation between that unseen witness and the egoic thoughts that are arising. So the self can identify with ego. So with a transcendent experience of with transcending the ego, the self knows itself as not being ego. So even a moment of going beyond that egoic identity, you know yourself not to be ego. The ego may be there, but its sort of hold in defining you loosens till it no longer defines you at all. You can realize a bigger dimension, deeper dimension. And this can be permanent, but often it's not. Usually we go back and forth. We could feel a sense of flow for some time, nature arising and passing away, but ego often reemerges and puts itself back together again. But it's never as complete as it was before, from what I've seen and what I've heard others report. There's always, it's never as complete and put together. And you may not even notice. It's the funny thing is you can have these these tastes, and you might not even notice if you're practicing regularly over years that the ego identification is really softening and shifting. People may say things like, well, you don't blame me for things as much as you used to. A friend might report that. Or you just don't react when you're stuck in a traffic jam or a lineup at the grocery store, or you don't react when somebody gets angry at you, or you don't react. I mean, so that you start to notice, and this is the self's identification with ego releasing, softening, opening. And so it's not necessarily just this flash and ego's gone. It's most often this gradual kind of loosening of, almost like something loosening their grip on you. Because for me, the ego really, once I noticed it loosening, it felt like there was almost a grip that was softening. It's something that had a hold on my consciousness, my self-consciousness. The ego, of course, can hold on to insights or moments of awakening. So as soon you can have an insight, and soon the thought could arise, oh, I don't want to lose this. That's an egoic thought, right? I don't want to lose this is an egoic thought. As soon as you have this thought, I don't want to lose this, recognize that that's the ego putting its hold around what the insight that you just experienced or had. It's the egoic self-concern. So as soon as you grasp at anything, this is solidifying the ego. Right? So the action of the ego is grasping and holding on and pushing away. What the Buddha called clinging. And as I mentioned before, as the ego begins to fall away, great fears can arise. It's sometimes called the dark night of the soul by some Christian mystics. It's the fear that there'll be no one to experience life. That life will be a big void of nothingness. And the fear of of death itself for the ego. The falling away of ego is, to the ego, a kind of death. This, of course, has nothing to do with reality, but it is only what ego imagines reality to be. Because remember, I said the ego can't conceptualize something that's beyond itself, can't imagine anything beyond itself, so it can only include that this involves its annihilation, right? So, and you may experience these fears in different ways, and I'll go into this in more detail. I've gone through a fair bit of this in the last year in my own life and my own practice. And then finally, to recognize that the ego will, so even the ego's actions to go beyond itself is still an act of self-concern. So the wanting to be enlightened, it can be the ego's act, an egoic act of self-concern. So we're letting go of all of that. And that's why these teachings are tricky, because we can, like I said, create this imagined future that the ego can then grasp onto, which just solidifies the ego, and it's now counterproductive. So if you're going to let go of, I was going to say, if you're going to let go of anything, the most important thing you can let go of is the egoic striving for some kind of spiritual awakening or enlightenment. And there could be truth in what I just said, but you have to let go of it all, including the this egoic act of self-concern, of the egoic desire to even go beyond itself. So I hope that gives you good definitions and some background into what we'll be talking about, sort of what we'll be exploring. So we're going to be exploring ways to separate the self and the ego, ways to transcend the ego, to transcending the ego to the extent that the ego can fall away, and then noticing when the self then reemerges identified with something else, like a spiritual experience, and then the falling away of all self-identification. So what I was saying just before about, the ego can even create an imagined future that you can then cling to. This is, I think, why the don't know mind is so important in this practice. So we're letting go of what you think you know about anything. So the mind cannot know what is beyond its current state of consciousness. I've had so many teachers say that to me that it's kind of burnt into the mind cannot know what is beyond its current state of consciousness. So you don't know. You may think that it can know or that it does know, but this is often a defense mechanism, preventing the falling away of the ego. This is a defense mechanism. This is how the ego sustains itself, by thinking that it knows, believing that it knows. Simply a defense mechanism that the ego can use to kind of keep itself at the center. So don't worry about what's around the next corner. Don't worry about what's supposed to be happening. Thinking we know is a defense against realizing it. Right? So let yourself live in the unknown, the unknowing known. There was a famous teacher that used that phrase, the unknowing known. I can't remember who it was. I think it was a Christian mystic of one or the other. So don't think you can know anything about that which you haven't experienced. Right? So you can have realizations, right, and understandings based on your direct experience. That's different from sort of an egoic knowing, in the sense of philosophical, conceptual knowledge. So don't think you can know anything about that which you've not experienced. So that's why it's so important to not just give you, fill your mind with ideas, but rather to give you direct practices where you can have experience transcending. Again, the language fails me here. They're not transcendent experiences is not really what I'm trying to say, but I hope you get what I'm pointing to. So we can really what's the word? We can connect with a deeper impulse. There is a impulse within us. You would not be here on a July Thursday evening, right? Think about that. You're here in a July. Some of you are at cottages or at home, and you could be relaxing. Whatever, you're here because there's a deeper impulse. So we can connect with that deeper impulse when we let go of knowing. Okay, so let go of knowing. Step into don't know mind. Okay, I'm just going to quickly, and then I'll open it up for some questions. We're going to go through what I'm calling 4 steps to, well, here it says 4 steps to knowing the ego. That's not really probably what I'm wanting to say. It's kind of the 4 steps through experiencing no self. And there's lots more steps that I could put in here, but these are the 4 that have kind of come to the fore when I reflected on sort of what I've gone through, what I've seen others go through. So the number 1 is creating a distance between self and ego. And this is really the witnessing, seeing how we can actually, and we've done this many, many times, resting in awareness. So the foundational meditation, as I call it, is where we're resting in awareness and just noticing all the objects arising and falling away, right? We're observing our thoughts and feelings like clouds floating through the sky or leaves floating down a stream and so on. Here we're being taught to disengage with the ego and to engage self, engage witness, self as witness. So we're seeing, self as awareness, as silence, stillness, quiet. I've used all those terms to kind of point to something beyond our egoic arisings, what arises, egoic thoughts and so on. So this, practicing with self as witness, it's very freeing, and it's really kind of, it can have the experience of like waking up from a dream, the dream of ego, and you experience what self is, the self as a witness, self as awareness, different dimension of self. But we're even in this practice letting go of that, right? Self as witness. The second step is seeing how our thoughts and grasping constantly create an egoic self. And for me, this was mind-blowing. Or maybe that's why it's a step. It's a practice in and of itself. So you're watching the mind and you're noticing that every thought is simply a thought, especially all the thoughts that refer to a personal self. So many of our thoughts are self-referential. Have you noticed that? Like, you sit and watch. I mean, we'll be doing this practice down the road, but you can start it now. All the thoughts, 90%, I'd say, or 95% of my thoughts were self-referential. And you may start to notice that this is really what is the state of our minds. So we start to look at, well, what does this me thought refer to? If you look deep, you'll see that the thought simply infers a me or an ego. Each thought referring to an ego merely refers to another thought. Matthew Flickstein said this was tracing back our thoughts is a practice he taught me. So each thought about me refers to another thought. I am good, I am bad, I am enlightened, I am not enlightened. Just a thought that refers to another thought. And step 3 is looking to see if you can find a self anywhere. And we played with this when we did the 5, what are called the 5 aggregates or khandhas. So looking to see if you can find a self in body, feeling tone, mental formations, perceptions, or consciousness. And we'll be looking at that as well. So we're looking to see, can we find a self anywhere? Is there this thing called self? Is it actually something here that I can point to and find? And then finally, the 4th step, and I probably insert some more steps in there. There might be 5 or 6 by the time. The 4th step, or the kind of final step, I guess, however many steps there end up being. The final step is seeing the world from the eyes of the infinite or the eternal. So seeing the world from the eyes of the infinite. So in order to even approach this, we have to let go of the entire egoic perspective that always names and comments and interprets everything. So we're pulling all the narration and interpretation, putting it all aside, all this narration, interpretation, we're putting it all aside. We're not, and so I mean, and seeing the world through the eyes of the divine, you could say, the infinite, through God, if to use a more theistic terminology. But we're not trying to do this. Again, like I can become an egoic project, right? I'm trying to see the world. The ego can actually take that on as a thing that it needs to do. So we're not trying, it's not something we're trying to do. Instead, we kind of call it forth. And I'll talk about what I mean by calling it forth. Yeah, so if you're trying to do this, then you're simply activating your imagination. And you start the narrating mind again, right? As soon as you activate that imagined future. The eyes of eternity simply gaze. I did a retreat with Lama Suradas, and he called it stargazing. I don't know if any of you have come across that terminology from Lama Suradas, but we did a whole week of stargazing, and we were inside, so I'm not. At first I said, how are we going to see stars? I thought, but he was really just talking about gazing, just the eyes of eternity is just, you're just gaze. There's just a gaze. And I'll end, I'm going to end with a quote from Sri Nisargadatta, the Indian, I guess you'd say he was a Advaita Vedanta teacher. And here's a quote from Nisargadatta. The real world is beyond our thoughts and ideas. We see it through the lens of our desires, divided into pleasure and pain, right and wrong, inner and outer. To see the universe as it is, you must step beyond the net. It is not hard to do. It's not hard to do so, for the net is full of holes. The net is full of holes. So the practice for the week, and I'll give you more detailed practices in subsequent weeks, but this one, I'll keep this one simple. Noticing when self-referential thoughts arise. Sounds simple, right? Just simply noticing when self-referential thoughts arise. So we're not judging as bad, right? So the ego is not bad. Sometimes we think we use the word, sometimes in Western psychology, ego can seen as a bad thing. Ego is not a bad thing. We're simply noticing self-referential thoughts arising. And notice how much of your thinking is self-referential. This, as I said, blew my mind. Like I never thought. You kind of you have an idea that you have a lot of me thoughts during the day, right? Everybody probably has a sense that, yeah, I have a lot of me thoughts during the day. But what'll blow your mind is that it's pretty much all your mind does. It's very little else. Like, in fact, I remember I sat for like, over a very extended period of time watching this. And when a non-me thought arose, it was like it shocked me. I went, what was that? It was a non-me thought. Geez, that took 5 hours for that to arise, right? And so it is shocking to see it, but you just see sort of how deeply entrenched and identified we are with the ego. So how much of our time, I guess you could say, how much of our thinking is all about grasping and pushing away, or clinging, as the Buddha would say, because that's the activity of the ego, right? This struggle with what is. The struggle with what is grasping and pushing away, right? So really we're looking at how that arises, but we can look at it as thoughts arising or as grasping and pushing away arising. So we're looking for these me, mine thoughts. So we're actually in this step seeing how pervasive identification with the ego is. And it may sound like a simple step in this process, but it's a step that we really, I think, in my experience, we have to see in order to start to loosen our identification with the ego. It's just to see how pervasive it is. Okay, so I will open it up for some questions.